Kia ora koutou, welcome to the Happy Revolution podcast. My name is Matthew Bartlett and I'm a Christian chaplain at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. We've got a slightly unusual episode for you today. Rather than an interview, it's a recording of a recent presentation given by Professor Cyril Hovorun at Chaplaincy VUW. The topic is An Orthodox Theology of Peace for Ukraine. Cyril is an Archimandrite in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and teaches international relations at University College Stockholm. As you'll hear, Cyril has been personally connected with many of the key figures on both sides of the Russia-Ukraine war and Orthodox churches on either side of the divide as well. Now I'll pass over to my fellow chaplain, the Reverend Dr. Matthew Packer, to introduce Cyril and the session.
Kia ora tātou. Welcome to Ramsey House, everyone, and to a special presentation, An Orthodox Theology of Peace for Ukraine. My name is Matthew Packer, and I'm one of the chaplains at the university. And for those who are new here, I wanted to say the chaplaincy is a place you can visit anytime for a friendly listening ear and for practical help, regardless of your beliefs or religious denomination. The chaplains are also here to encourage deep thinking about the world and its challenges, and to do so from a variety of robust Christian perspectives. Just before I introduce Cyril today, I'd like to acknowledge the help of Dr. Corinne Seals and Dr. Philip Fountain for their help in arranging today's talk. We are very honoured to have Dr. Cyril Hovorun presenting today. He originally studied theoretical physics, he's a far-out guy, before moving into theology at Kiev Theological Academy. He has a master's in theology from Athens National University and a PhD in theology from Durham University. He's done further research at Yale and Columbia. Now, today, he teaches at University College Stockholm and also directs the Huffington Ecumenical Institute at Loyola Marymount in California. He's taught or lectured at a breathtaking array of academic institutions, in fact, with a central focus on international relations and ecumenism. So Cyril today will talk for 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So time is pretty tight. I think it's my prerogative to ask the first question ahead of the game. Cyril, I'm wondering what an Archimandrite is, but perhaps you can share as we go. So let's give him a warm welcome. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you. And thank you for coming to this meeting. Archimandrite is a very exotic title. In the 4th century Egypt, it meant someone who was in charge of several monastic communities, like a bishop for the monks without being a bishop. Nowadays in the Orthodox world, it's like almost a bishop, but not yet there. I consider myself as kind of post-bishopric kind of situation. I would like, because I prefer now more kind of academic meetings than the ecclesial celebrations, whatever, like this one. Thank you for coming. I know that it's not always already attractive, interesting to hear about Ukraine again and again. I remember Max Weber, this famous German sociologist. He's famous for introducing this term, this idea of routinization of charisma. Basically, it means that there is like an abundance of charisma, and then people get tired of this charisma, and then they establish the church. But then I discovered that Max Weber told not just about routinization of charisma, but also about what he called routinization of the sword, meaning the routinization of violence, routinization of war, meaning that in the beginning the war looks very unusual, very kind of provocative, mind-changing, and disturbing, disrupting, and then it becomes routinized. I believe now in Ukraine the war is exactly in the stage of routinization, which means that people don't often get interested. You got interested, thank you for coming. You just defy Max Weber. And I'm going to talk about the topic which is very urgent at this stage of the war, which is peace. There are a lot of talks about peace. Everyone speaks about peace in Ukraine, from Trump to anyone else. And speaking about peace for Ukraine, I just need first to say a few words about the idea of theology of peace in the Orthodox theology. I do a lot of things, a lot of also teaching on Orthodox political theology, and peace is a part of it, but it's not a prominent part of it. In the Orthodox Church, in the Orthodox tradition, or Eastern Christian tradition generally, we don't have such a concept as just war, for example. This concept goes back to Augustine, became prominent in the Western tradition of Christianity, was developed further by Thomas Aquinas, and then was introduced to the social doctrine of the Catholic Church, for example, and also widely discussed in the framework of the Western political theologies, in the broad sense, which include also other non-Catholic traditions. In Orthodoxy, we never had those discussions about, what is, if there is such a thing as just war. Yet of course, we had wars, and moreover, during the last 40 years in Europe, all wars that were waged in Europe were with some involvement of the Orthodox churches, between Orthodox people or with the participation of the Orthodox people. It's you may begin with the Yugoslavian wars, which were quite violent, even genocidal, like in Croatia. You may take then the wars in the Middle East. With, of course, it was not the war with a kind of key role of the Orthodox churches, but with some participation of the Orthodox churches. And then the key role was played in the wars like in Georgia, the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, and of course then the war in Ukraine. So the Orthodox are now the main troublemakers. It's not Islam anymore. We are the main troublemakers. For which reason I encourage you to study us, because usually when we create troubles, we become interesting. Yes, the Orthodox theology of peace, I would say, flourished paradoxically in the period of the Cold War. In the period of the Cold War, when there was like this antagonism of the two blocks, the communist and the capitalist, what we called in the Soviet Union capitalist bloc, there was the policy of detention because of the nuclear potentiality capable of destroying both sides of the antagonism. There were a lot of conversations about peace. And on behalf of the Soviet Union at the time, the role of the Russian Orthodox Church was to promote peace, to promote at least the lip service to the peace. Of course, the Soviet Union developed its nuclear arsenal, threatened the rest of the world with nukes, but pretended to be a peacemaker and a peace builder, and accused the West of waging the war and trying to destroy the rest of humanity with its nukes, while the Soviet Union presented itself as like a dove, in this very cruel world of imperialism and capitalism. And the rhetoric of peace was expected to be articulated, to be promulgated by the Russian Orthodox Church. At that time, therefore, we could observe, if we just study the documents published by the officials of the Russian Church, we could find a lot of statements, a lot of words speaking about peace, the necessity of peace, including this is like 4 guys who I would consider as kind of important in developing the idea of peace or war in the modern Russian setting. So the Patriarch of Moscow here, Kirill, he was actually my boss. I worked for him as his secretary for 10 years, so he was my boss. And then we disagreed, and then I quit my job. Actually, my job with him was to be advocatus diaboli, to test his ideas, kind of critiquing, because he was quite open-minded and he wanted his ideas to be tested. So after we disagreed and I quit my job, I continued the job, testing his ideas, now without his consent and without his approval, of course, to the extent that I was defrocked by him recently. And but he, in the Soviet time, in the period of the Cold War, he was really one of the main speakers on behalf of the Russian Church and the Soviet state about peace. He was really a proponent, a rhetorician who spoke a lot about peace, which nowadays we can question his sincerity, because after the circumstances changed, he is now the main proponent of the theology of war. Moreover, he became really a proponent of the idea which he somehow mentioned as the idea of sacred war. Even though this idea was not his, this idea was for the first time articulated by this guy, Cyril Chaplain. He was like the brain behind Kirill. Sometimes I explain Kirill as like in the terms of ancient Greek political roles. In ancient Greece, there were 2 basic political roles: a philosopher and a rhetorician. So philosophers invented ideas, rhetoricians promoted them. articulated them. So Kirill is not a philosopher, he's a rhetorician. Chaplain was a philosopher. He passed away soon after the COVID. He was a part of the brain, so kind of one half of Kirill's brain, Chaplain. I believe, I modestly admit, I was the other kind of half of the brain, and we always kind of argued with one another. I tried to be what I believe to be on the good side of the kind of argument. Chaplain, even before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February 2014, I remember it very well. In January 2014, Chaplain actually called for the war to begin, to be waged by Russia, when no one expected Russia to invade Ukraine, no one, including us in Ukraine. And it was so kind of unusual and striking, like you say, what are you talking about, you know? And he started talking about the war in Ukraine, against Ukraine, the need of the war against Ukraine from Russia a month before the invasion. Then 2015 happened, and then the war in Syria happened, and Russia sent its troops to Syria. And Chaplain tried to justify sending troops to Syria by, for the first time, mentioning the idea of sacred war. And he said that what Russia is doing is actually waging a sacred war against jihadists, against, he didn't say infidels. Well, in Russia, they are very cautious not to insult Islam because, well, 20% of the Russian population are Muslims. But certainly against ISIS, against the Caliphate. It should be said that at that time, in 2015, when Chaplain actually said for the first time that we need a sacred war, it was not appreciated in the Kremlin. Chaplain was closely related to the Kremlin, and he consulted the Kremlin on many matters. But when he said this, that Russia needs like the sacred war in Syria, wages a sacred war in Syria, he eventually was dismissed from his positions. Well, the sacred war rhetoric was not the only reason why he was dismissed, but it was one of the reasons why he was dismissed. So at that time, the Kremlin was not yet happy about calling its wars as sacred. It's to the question about the evolution of the rhetoric. So at that time, it was not yet the mainstream rhetoric. But certainly later on, it evolved. This evolution kind of happened. A couple of years ago, eventually a forum which is called the World Russian People's Council, which is like a political arm of the Russian Orthodox Church, a platform where different politicians and church leaders and church figures come together and discuss matters of politics and social life, officially declared. This platform, this council, which comprises like really thousands of people, thousands of delegates, of participants, articulate for the first time that what is happening in Ukraine is a sacred war. And this guy is to be credited for this, because this guy is one of the key organizers of this council. And he has substituted Chaplain. After Chaplain died, his name is Alexander Shipkov. He became like a substitute for Chaplain as a part of the brain of Kirill. Actually, it seems like he has occupied the entire skull of Kirill. He is now the main ideologist of the idea of the sacred war and of Russian war in Ukraine and elsewhere in the Russian Orthodox Church. Well, he considers me as his arch enemy, kind of. He has called me a heretic because I develop a public theology which is alternative to his. He develops basically the public theology, the theology of political theology centered on the state, on the central role of the state. The state is the main partner for the church. Well, I argue the opposite, that it is the civil society that needs to be the main partner for the church. And I kind of develop the theology which has been branded as the theology of the Maidans. You know, Maidan, the popular revolutions in Ukraine that ousted the dictators like Yanukovych in Ukraine 2014. And, well, what I try to develop has been called the theology of Maidan, and Shipkov considers is the most heretical kind of sort of political theology in Orthodoxy that can be.
What is that word, Cyril? The theology of?
Maidan. Maidan is the main square in Kiev, where all the popular revolts happened, and well, it was also they were also religious phenomena, as it were, those revolts. So Shipkov is now the main ideology. He tries really to develop an ideology of the war and of invasion, and generally the framework of relationship between the church and the state in modern Russia. And then, of course, that is the most recognizable person, Alexander Dugin, probably recognized, because he, that's how people in the West know the Russian theology or Russian ideology, through him, even though I think he's the least representative of this theology, speaking in the Russian terms, because he's so complicated for an average Russian that he's very much complicated to himself. He's really inconsistent and quite delusional. Some people say, kind of speculate that he's on the substances, and probably hence is his change of his perception of the world. But people try to kind of get a clue about what is happening in the Russian ideological laboratory, as it were, through him. I think it's a wrong approach. I was recently approached by Brill to preface a collection of essays on Dugin's ideology / theology / philosophy. People try kind of to decode, as it were, Putinism by understanding Dugin. I believe they try basically to construct Dugin to the extent that would be properly unrecognizable by Dugin himself. But that's another story. However, Dugin is interesting in the sense of he is a very complicated philosopher, inconsistent philosopher. He's really has a torrent of consciousness or some consciousness, but he can articulate some ideas very precisely, very concisely through slogans like this one, where he mentions, that is his quote, very recent one, like a week ago. He published it a week ago on his social media when he said, "I would rename our modest special military operation," that's how it's a euphemism, Russian euphemism for the war against Ukraine, "to the sword of the katechon." Well, katechon is a very important concept. It's an important concept in the Eastern Christian political theology. It goes back to the Byzantine times. Of course, it is related to Paul's very obscure phrase about katechon, someone who holds. In the Byzantine political theology, it developed into the idea that the emperor, the Basileus, is the one who holds the world on his shoulders. And if the ruler, katechon, upholds the Orthodox faith without any corruption, then the world stands on his shoulders, as it were. As you probably know, Carl Schmitt, the father of the modern Western political theology, utilized this word, this concept of katechon, in application to Hitler, to Führer. And for him, the German ruler is such a katechon. Nowadays, this term has become very popular in modern Russia, and it is applied mostly to Putin. So they consider Putin as their katechon, as the upholder of truth and upholder of the integrity of the world, basically. And in Russia, they have become very envious, really envious, about Trump trying to play the same role. They say, no, katechon is ours, it's not him. So this kind of rivalry between the Russian, political theologians and their American counterparts in claiming katechon, whose is katechon, to whom he belongs. Yes, and it's interesting that Dugin connected the idea of the war with the idea of katechon. And he says that the war is the sword of the katechon. So it means that the war has really cosmic dimension, a cosmic meaning. Something that Kirill himself also said, that he said very early in the war that our battle is really of cosmic dimension. It's really a battle against the global powers of evil. It's not just about against Ukraine, not even about against the arch enemy of Russia, which is America, but it's against the kind of demons and devil himself. It's really, cosmic. It's really almost in the Gnostic sense, because the Gnostics also believe that they can fight literally, like the forces of evil. And Gnostics had this dualistic worldview, seeing the world in black and white, which is very much the worldview of Putin and Kirill and other proponents of the war in Russia, because they see the world in black and white in a very Gnostic Manichaean way. For this reason, the war will end for them only when they will conquer the global evil, which is impossible, of course. That's why it's endless. And it seems that the war is at the stage in Russia, at least from the Russian perspective, when it cannot end. Putin also perceives this endless war in utilitarian terms. He understands that if he stops the war, and he is the only person who can stop the war. No other kind of Trump can't, Zelensky can't. No one can't except Putin. Putin can say stop and then it will stop. But he understands the moment he says stop to the war, all those kind of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, killers, who are trained to kill, who are very well paid, money they never had seen in their life, because they are recruited mostly from very poor areas of Russia, and they are paid very kind of handsomely, and their families rely on that, and that's why, for example, that's the situation. A typical situation of recruiting is like this, sounds like this. A wife would say to her husband, usually an alcoholic, not really earning money for the family, in some very remote area of Russia, she would say to him, look, there is no use of you. Go and fight. If you come back, you will bring us money we've never seen. If you get killed, I will get even more money. So it's like a win-win situation for the family. Of course, you may lose your life, but it's worthless anyways. And they go, and they fight. So imagine those people would come back, hundreds of thousands would come back to Russia, and the only thing they've learned is to kill. It means civil war in Russia, and Putin understands that. That's one of the reasons he doesn't want to stop this war. And another one is the economy has been rebuilt to supply the war with weapons, with everything. And as some scholars of Balkan War say, I remember in one conversation, he said, the war will continue as long as it pays. So the war pays the clique of Putin. It pays all those people around him who could become super rich. And actually the number of billionaires in those circles, it increases according to Forbes, statistics, which means the war pays very well, handsomely for the circle of Putin, and there is no reason to stop it. But those guys try to explain why it is kind of endless. So there are pragmatic calculations from the side of Putin, but there are also attempts to make the war cause more noble. Basically, they want to prove that war is not about money. It's about, the goodness of the humankind. It's about winning the cosmic battle finally that Christ himself started. And now it's our mission, to finish the job of Christ, People like Dugin try to explain this. While Russians have this concept of sacred war, and I mean on the top of the church and of the state, we in Ukraine, we prefer to speak not about sacred war, but about sacred peace. Peace is super important for us, of course. And we try to develop, and that's what I try to develop, our own theology of peace. And let me show you now the next slide. And I'll try to explain. Basically, this is an experiment, an intellectual experiment, if you want. And I based it on some concepts developed in the 7th century by a prominent theologian in the East, Maximus the Confessor. He himself suffered from the state. He was exiled as a traitor and killed and died in exile in Georgia, what is now modern Georgia. And he developed a concept, in application to Christology, to explain Jesus Christ and God. He developed this concept of logos. Logos is something common, which is a commonality which features and is featured by different phenomena, hypostasis, the concrete things, the concrete phenomena. They feature some elements of the logos is up there, that stem from God, and in order, like for example, this table has its own logos. The logos of this table, as any other table in the world, is to serve as something to put on, right, for example, and to have some legs, and to have a platform, like basically. That is the logos of the table. In the same way, more complicated things can have also their logoi and their hypostasis, including peace. So peace has its own logos, and peace has its own implications, has own manifestations, incarnations, or hypostasis, as we call them, hypostasis. And in application to peace, it means that there is like a common logos of peace we believe. If there is no a common logos of peace, if there is no a common understanding of peace, then I believe peace is unattainable, unachievable. Of course, we cannot never achieve the peace completely. We cannot have peace in the fullest form, but it does, and of course, every peace is different from another peace. In every country, in every community, peace is on its own, has a different form. But at least we have the common understanding of what is peace. And for example, we share the same understanding of what is peace with ancient Greeks, who developed, like Aristotle, who developed the concept of peace in his Ethics, for example. And we go through Christianity, we go through, well, peace in Christ, you know, we speak about different theological concepts of peace. It's the same peace, basically. Of course, we can have different interpretations and words for this peace. We can have different instances of peace, but it is the same peace. That's the basic idea. Peace should have a common logos. I'll try to identify now some features of peace. What is peace? And then Maximus spoke about the incarnations of this common idea, logos, as tropos. Tropos is the way in Greek, right? So every peace is incarnated in a particular way, in a particular country. And then those incarnations of peace, they become incarnated in different nations, different countries. Like New Zealand had its own peace after Maori Wars, for example. There was peace, right, eventually. And this is a peace that cannot be repeated anywhere else, because the circumstances here were different from any other country. But there was like a tropos of peace of New Zealand, right? Every other country, including like Ukraine, we also want peace. Every peace, every tropos of peace has to have its own kind of rationale, of course its own tropos, but also some common features. Another Christological concept that was developed by Maximus and others was in application to Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ's nature, human nature, has its nature, essence, but also its qualities, properties. So and Maximus argued, and others argued, that look, if humanity of Jesus Christ has this and this feature, then it is a true humanity. If it lacks at least one feature, in the case of Maximus, it was human will. For example, if the humanity of Jesus Christ lacks human will, then it's not really nature. It's something else. Let's call it something else, but it's not human nature. In application to peace, it would mean that every peace, yes, they are all different sorts of pieces, but all of them, New Zealand, Ukraine, I don't know, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, they should have a particular set of basic features. Without one of them, this cannot be called peace. It's something else. Let's call it something else, like Trump's peace deal, right? It looks like peace, but it's not peace because it lacks some very substantial features. And I believe those features are here. And I'm about to conclude. Yeah, I know, it's very complicated. I'll try to explain it. It's a scheme that comes from another Eastern theologian. His name was Leontios of Byzantium. He lived just before Maximus, approximately a century before Maximus. Leontios of Byzantium. He was like a great theologian, 6th century, a century before Maximus. And he created like an ontological pyramid of all things. And he argued that on the top of everything is a hypostasis. Hypostasis is kind of each of us, for example. We are hypostasis. Hypostasis of the divine image, of the imago Dei, right? But we also share essence. All of us, we have essence. Because we are human beings, all of us, regardless of our race, regardless of our origins, of anything, we are human beings. We are unique hypostasis, and at the same time, we're all human beings because we share the same ousia, essence. And then we share the same essence that should have the same properties, essential properties. Here. This essential property, there are some kind of, he also developed this idea, supra-essential property, is something which is kind of commoner among our nature than just properties. I will not explain, but it will take us like another hour. But I just want to say that there is a hierarchy of properties, as it were. So there are more general properties of a nature, and there are more particular properties of the nature. In application to peace, it means that in order to have hypostasis, the hypostasis of peace, a real peace, substantial, sustainable, a lasting peace, it should be based on the essence of peace. The same idea as logos. It should correspond to the logos of peace. It should have this commonality. And what these commonalities include? For me, I believe justice is one of the features. So the peace should be just. If peace lacks justice, it's not peace. Let's call it something else. Again, primarily, well, I believe that's the idea of Trump's peace. It's peace without justice. Therefore, it cannot be peace. It can be like ceasefire or a deal, or like, for example, I've been recently to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Trump tried to strike a deal there between Rwanda and Congo. He declared his stopped 125th war or whatever there, and he called it peace by striking a deal between the two countries, but essentially forcing them to redirect their resources from the Eastern Congo to the American corporations like Cobalt and others, from which those things are made. As a result, the occupation of some eastern cities in DRC continues. So it's not peace. In the eyes of Trump, it's peace, but it's not, because it lacks justice. Also, I believe every peace should have ethics. Ethics is a kind of superstructure, super category that includes justice. Because justice can be, we can understand what is just and what is not just only in the ethical framework that features the system of coordinates of goodness and evil. So if we remove goodness and evil, then there is no ethics, there is no peace, there is no justice. And that's what is happening in the case of the moral theology, if we can call it, moral theology of Trump and Putin, basically. Because Putin, in his moral matrix, system of coordinates, he just swapped, good with evil. What is kind of in the common understanding is good, for him it's evil, and vice versa. So the ethical system is kind of reversed in Putinism. In Trump's world, he has substituted goodness and evil with other categories. What is for us good, for him is strong or profitable. What is for us is bad, for him is non-profitable and weak, basically. So it's like a substitution of ethical norms. Therefore, ethics lacks in both understandings of peace for Putin and for Trump. And therefore, justice is impossible. Therefore, the logos of peace is impossible. And therefore, hypothesis of peace just collapses, rolls down. I hope you get my point. So it's very kind of ontological, it's very Christological, if you want. It's an experiment, intellectual experiment. I tried to apply my first field. I studied my thesis was on Christology, and I tried to apply Christology to the peace studies. Hence is my kind of conclusion. I'm concluding. Only that kind of peace can be achieved and can be called peace in Ukraine, which features the ethical dimension, justice, and only that peace can be sustainable. Otherwise, it's not peace. Thank you.
Kia ora, everybody. Matthew Bartlett's my name. I'm one of the other chaplains along with Matthew Packer, and I'll be chairing the Q&A session. I want to take the opportunity to sneak one question in, which is this beautiful vision. How might it get into Patriarch Kirill's mind? And if it did, how would that get into Putin's mind?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it got into Putin's mind from Kirill. Kirill is really the mastermind of Putinism. It should be called Cyrillism, not really Putinism. Because Putin always had a very small mind. In KGB, his nickname was a cigarette butt. Because he's really small. He's really small. That's why they photograph him, from below. And his mind was never big. He never thought big. I was never able to think big. And Kirill was able. I knew him because I worked for him for 10 years, as I said. So I knew his mind very well. Properly, I know it better than most people. And his mind was always really big. Very big ambitions, very big political ambitions. And for Kirill, it is an interesting combination of quite superficial theological ideas, I would say, because he was never trained theologically properly. A very big, interesting political ideas, because he studied and he took some political ideas. Like, for example, I remember him being absolutely fascinated by Samuel Huntington's ideas of the clash of civilizations. Those ideas were brought from the United States by Chaplin. Chaplin imported them from the US, from some of the neoconservative meetings there to Moscow, and he just infected Kirill with those ideas. He was absolutely fascinated by them, and he repeated them again and again. And he made those ideas of the clash of civilizations the basis of his political theology. So it's a combination of political ideas and combination of very superficial theological ideas. And in addition to huge political ambitions, it produced this kind of ideology, which is very similar, I believe, to what I've observed in the United States in the case of J.D. Vance. I believe there is a similarity between Kirill and J.D. Vance, because J.D. Vance basically tries to construct Trumpism, the ideology of Trump. Trump, of course, would not have a clue about Trumpism. He would not understand a single thing about Trumpism, but it has its kind of umbrella and his name tag on it. The main designer or demiurge of Trumpism, I believe, is J.D. Vance. But again, J.D. Vance is a rhetorician. He's not a philosopher. He gathers together. He brings together those people who are capable of philosophical thinking, like Curtin Yarvis or Rod Dreher, for example, and J.D. Vance is a very superficial theologian himself. Just a year ago, February 2025, I attended a meeting in D.C. where he presented. It was the International Religious Forum, a summit forum. And he lectured us on patristics, on Tertullian, which was bizarre. Because it was like a lecture, by someone who just enrolled to a seminary, first class of seminary. And he learned this name, Tertullian. And all of a sudden, he became a professor on Tertullian. He began teaching us, which was funny. I laughed at it because it was so, childish. But he believed that it was kind of a serious thing. And he tried to kind of construct a sort of political theology on the basis of Tertullian, of Augustine, and so forth. Kirill is very similar. Kirill doesn't know very much patristics. He believes he knows, like Vance, and he combines them with political ideas. In the case of J.D. Vance, those ideas, like, for example, I believe, and I have traced, because I was at Yale at the same time with J.D. Vance. That's kind of a disclosure. I was in the same time, I did my postdoctoral research at Yale Divinity, and he was at Yale Law School. And I spent a lot of time, most of my time in the library of Yale Law School, because I studied church-state relations. There's like several shelves of great books on church-state relations. So I can attest, I've never seen the guy in the library. He was probably partying somewhere. But he had some ideas. He made some studies. For example, I believe his mentor, Paul Kahn, who was a professor, he's still a professor of constitutional law at the law school at Yale, who actually reintroduced Carl Schmitt to the American academia. He basically published a book in 2012 by Columbia University Press, I believe, or 2011, with the same title as Carl Schmitt's, a book, Political Theology, the Four Foundations for Sovereignty, something like that. And he reintroduced Carl Schmitt, sort of absolved him of his sins of Nazism and to the American academia. And I think he influenced Vance. So Vance's idea come from those sources. Again, very superficial, very uneducated, I would say, but with a huge ambition. And that is kind of the similarity between the two guys. So those guys picked up those ideas from different sources. They combined them into some kind of system, ideological system, and then they just put those ideas into the heads of their bosses. That's how it worked. Sorry, it's a very long answer to probably. Yeah.
I have two questions, one more specific, one a bit more general. Thank you for this conceptualization of how peace would look for Ukraine, but what do you think about different conceptualizations from different parts of Ukraine, like Ukrainian politicians versus Ukrainian military versus Ukrainian clergy versus people from different parts? That's the specific one. And more general, so given what I've heard, your explanation about essences of peace, so if we try to imagine all the people living life in peace, quote, quote, is it possible, and does Orthodox theology say anything about peace for everyone?
Well, we have in Ukraine a different, I would say, a different experience of peace than probably the rest of the world, most of the world. Maybe some other places like in Palestine, they have also very different experience of what is peace. For us, peace is not given. For us, peace is really a gift. It's something which needs to be gained and sustained on the everyday basis. So we kind of changed our perception. For us, before 2022, for us, even though the war had started already, but peace was the normal. It was given. And war was rather an exception. And all of a sudden it changed, and now we don't remember. I personally don't remember the time when it was peace. We have this kind of subjective perception that the feeling that the war was always there. The war is normal. Peace is not normal. Peace is like a kind of deviation of the war, Which I believe it's quite Aristotelian concept, because also even for Aristotle, war is more like a normal thing, and peace is more like pauses in this process of waging wars. So for us in Ukraine, we want peace, but we understand peace is not something given. And you are really luxury, and also quite uncautious when you perceive the peace as something which is always there. No, it's not. It can be destroyed in a minute like this. And then it's gone. And then you don't even realize. And then you will not remember how it was when peace was there. And therefore, yes, it's kind of our perception. And how does it correlate with the Orthodox? I don't know, honestly, because we don't have like sources in the Orthodox. Of course, we have the Byzantine Empire, which was always at the war. And there were always wars and battles and so forth. But actually, there were never a theology of war. as there were no theologies of peace in Byzantium, I would say. Yes, in Ukraine, again, everyone perceives the war and the peace in his or her own way, because it's always a unique experience. But there is, like what we share, we all share the experience of destruction, because we all lost someone whom we knew. We all saw like buildings collapsing and, drones flying over us, and it's like an everyday experience for everyone. That is the common denominator as well, which also creates like this feeling, what is peace for us? It's when all this stops. So when it stops, then we'll have peace. But then I believe there is a consensus, more or less a public consensus in Ukraine, that we need just and a sustainable peace. We understand that without just peace, there will be no war. We also understand that if we give up territories, there will be no peace. Because we tried it in 2014 when Crimea was annexed. And it was a kind of, yes, we never accepted it publicly that we give up on Crimea. But effectively, we said, yes, okay, let's say it's not ours. Let's try to live in peace. And it didn't work, because Crimea was just a step to the escalation of the war. So we understand that if we give up now the parts of Donbass that Putin demands, it will not be the end of the war. It will not be peace for us. It will be just a ceasefire. So we try to make sure that it's not ceasefire again, that it's really a sustainable peace.
Katie, I think I saw your hand.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had any wisdom to share for church leaders who minister in communities of Christians. How would you advise them to grow their community into being people of peace?
Thank you. Well, my experience again with the churches, including the global Christian churches, the first advice would be, don't harm. Better, if you don't know what to say, better keep silent. Because sometimes the churches advocate for peace, and they do it in such unhelpful way, I would say, that it harms more than it helps. Like, for example, the churches in Germany. I remember one of the figures in the ecumenical movement, prominent figure, I will not name him. He would say, well, we should avoid violence. We should not send, weapons to Ukraine. Maybe some radars, or maybe helmets to protect people, 500 helmets or so. But we should not get involved in this war, which would mean that we would have been kind of killed, all of us, as a result of this peace effort. And of course there would be peace, but it will be the same peace as on a graveyard. Well, we don't want this peace. We don't want the peace of graveyard that some Christian churches globally would advocate for. I'm very much, therefore, in line with, for example, Ron Williams, very close friend, who is very vocal, very articulate in his advocacy for peace, and I concur completely with his advocacy. I believe he's absolutely great, because he understands how to avoid the kind of unhelpful recipes for peace.
Sorry, I'm very curious about this ontology of sustainable peace. With the very basic foundation of ethics, because I assume this is more generalized for all countries to do with peace, if there are two countries which have a very different understanding of personal ethics, whether it comes from religion or from cultural differences, how do they find a way to come to peace? Do they have to come to some sort of consensus and compromise?
Yeah, I see. Well, that's why I said that we have, the entire humanity has had striving for peace since the prehistorical times, since antiquity and even before that. There were always talks about peace. Well, of course, there were always talks about war, and as a result, maybe the talks about peace. I don't know what was the first, the experience of war or the experience of peace. Again, I'm quite confused about that nowadays, given the circumstances. But there were always conversations about peace and war. And then, since then, it has continued. Religions changed. I should say, yes, I'm a Christian, but I would say it's not a particularly Christian notion of peace, of course. Religion changed, and perceptions, worldviews changed, philosophies changed, but the idea of peace remained. That's why I believe there is a kind of common logos of peace, a common concept. Of course, we can rationalize, articulate this concept in different ways, using different traditions and so forth. And that is a very tricky and interesting, really fascinating intellectual exercise to define what is peace. Right? It's fine, it's good. But any definition of peace would not exhaust this logos of peace, I believe. Yes, that's why I will leave you kind of in this uncertainty, because we can't define peace. I don't believe we can reach a consensus about peace. But we have this feeling that there is such a thing as peace, which is common for all epochs, all eras, all contexts and circumstances.
You said that the only one who could possibly stop the war or have any decision around that would be Putin.
Yeah.
My question is, what in your mind would be a necessary catalyst that may convince him or in some other way stop the war?
I don't believe there is anything that can convince him to stop the war. Not his surrounding, because it gets profited, and they're afraid to raise this question, or circumstance, whatever. Even the people of Russia would not stop him if they decided to stop, right? The only thing that can stop him is what I heard from a lady. I once was in Fiji. It's tricky, you know. You talk to people, different sorts of people, and you discuss Ukraine, and they have very different opinions. Usually, it's very hard to talk to people, educated people, I should say, because they have ideas, and you know. But simple people, they have very simple reactions. I remember I stayed on Fiji, on an island in Fiji, and a very simple local lady cooked for me, and we had this conversation about Ukraine, and she said, you know, but you need just to kill Putin, you know, and that will be the end. And I believe this is as simple as that. The only thing that can stop him is his death.
Do you believe that it wouldn't be kind of like a Hydra situation where if you cut off the face of the leader...
I don't know. There were many attempts at him. That's why he was paranoid for good reasons, certainly. Still, we are not quite sure if he leaves, actually, because, well, there are several Putins, they say, because he has doublers. Or maybe it will be eventually an AI Putin, who knows, you know. Yeah, it's possible. We can laugh at it, but it's pretty possible. It's not impossible, I would say. Well, probably he still lives. Yes, if he dies, which he doesn't want because he wants to live until 150, as we know. He really wants, he invests a lot of money, you know, through his daughter into continuing to live until 150. But even that, eventually he will die. Then it will probably stop the war. But again, I don't believe it will be a kind of sustainable peace yet, because I believe the most dangerous thing about Putin is not Putin himself, is Putinism, is the ideas, the set of ideas that were articulated in his name by people like Kirill of Moscow, and it will continue. So it's like with Hitler. Well, Hitler committed suicide, but then Nazis had to be reconstructed after him. So we need to deal with Putinism after Putin, and until we deconstruct it completely and dump it into trash bin, it will continue to be a danger for the humanity.
So does Trump play a role at all in the peace process?
He does, to the extent of, I mean, if he wanted, he would help to stop the war somehow. The thing is that he uses the easiest way to stop the war, meaning to force us to stop fighting back, which does not help.
Can you join me in thanking Cyril?